On the morning of March 20th, 1995, 5 men boarded 5 different trains on 3 subway lines in Tokyo, Japan. Each man was carrying a package wrapped to look like a lunchbox or a bottled drink. Each package contained liquid sarin, one of the most lethal nerve agents ever synthesized. Colorless, odorless, produced in a quantity that required a fully operational chemical weapons laboratory staffed by scientists with advanced degrees in chemistry, physics, and biology. Sarin began leaking onto the floors of 5 subway trains converging on Kasumigaseki Station, where several Japanese government ministries are located. 13 people died, 50 suffered severe permanent injuries, nearly 1,000 required hospitalization, and thousands more experienced symptoms. The men who carried the packages were not soldiers. They were not career criminals. They were not even people who had spent their lives in the margins of society. They were a medical doctor, a physicist, a graduate student, and an engineer. They were the most educated members of a religious organization that had promised them enlightenment, survival, and the truth about the nature of reality. They were the followers of a partially blind yoga teacher from rural Japan named Chizuo Matsumoto, who had renamed himself Shoko Asahara, who had told them he was the reincarnation of both Buddha and Jesus Christ, and who, on this Tuesday morning in March, had ordered them to poison the people of Tokyo. History has an official version, sanitized, approved, filed away. And then there's everything that didn't make it into that version. The programs that were classified before anyone could ask questions, the groups that gathered power in the shadows of ordinary life, the experiments in human consciousness that serious institutions funded, studied, and then buried. My name is Mila. This is The Periphery, dark history, hidden cults, and the edges of the human mind. Welcome to the part of the record they didn't want you to find. They classified it, and we're declassifying it, one episode at a time. To understand Aum Shinrikyo, you need to understand something about Japan in the 1980s. Japan's post-war economic miracle had produced one of the most educated, most technologically sophisticated, and most relentlessly achievement-oriented societies in the world. University entrance was ferociously competitive. Careers were demanding and hierarchical. The social expectation of conformity to work, to family, to institutional loyalty was enormous. And underneath all of that productivity and orderliness was something that doesn't appear in the economic statistics: a profound spiritual vacuum. The religious situation in Japan in the 1980s can be called an occult boom. People were looking for a religion, and many new religions appeared as a response to the needs of the Japanese. Aum Shinrikyo was initially such a religion, and in the beginning there was nothing to show that it would later become a terrorist organization. Japan, 1980s. World's second largest economy, among the highest rates of university enrollment globally, rising rates of social isolation, overwork, and what Japanese culture calls karoshi, death from overwork. A generation of highly educated young people who had achieved everything society asked of them and found it profoundly unsatisfying. Into this environment stepped Chizuo Matsumoto. He was born in 1955 in rural Kyushu, the 4th son of a poor family of tatami mat makers. He was born partially blind and was sent to a school for the blind. He failed the entrance exam for Tokyo University and went on to study acupuncture and Chinese herbal medicine. In 1982, he was arrested for selling fake remedies, and after his conviction for fraud, his business went bankrupt. And then he traveled to the Himalayas in 1987. He met with Buddhists and Hindu teachers. He sat across from the Dalai Lama. Briefly and unremarkably, in an encounter the Dalai Lama would later describe as meeting a strange Japanese man. He returned to Japan and announced that he had achieved enlightenment, that he had been given a special mission, that he was, in fact, the first truly enlightened being since Buddha himself, and he renamed himself Shoko Asahara. And then, in a one-bedroom apartment in Tokyo's Shibuya ward, he started a yoga class. What Asahara understood instinctively and quite brilliantly was what his generation of Japanese university students needed that they weren't getting. They needed meaning that went beyond examination scores. They needed community that went beyond corporate hierarchies. They needed a framework that could make sense of why achieving everything society had promised them had left them feeling so profoundly empty. Asahara understood what people needed at that moment and used it in the promotion of his religion. Levitation and supernatural abilities were introduced in the form of manga and anime, beloved by all Japanese, so that people could quickly catch the main idea. Living in society is boring, but joining Aum helps in making new friends, developing one's skills, and reaching enlightenment. The early Aum Shinrikyo was genuinely appealing. Yoga classes, meditation, a synthesis of Buddhist and Hindu philosophy delivered by a teacher who seemed to have actually achieved the inner peace students were desperately seeking. A community of intelligent, educated, and curious young people who had found each other. Shogo Asahara developed a large following, particularly among university students and other elites of Japan, by preaching a potent brew of dissatisfaction with prevailing religious options, the imminent onset of World War III, and the possibility of enlightenment and salvation despite these worldly realities. The apocalypse, he taught, was coming. A catastrophic nuclear war that would end civilization as they knew it, and only members of Aum Shinrikyo would survive. And if you were a young Japanese scientist or doctor or engineer in the late 1980s, brilliant, educated, and spiritually hungry, and quietly convinced that the society you'd been shaped to serve was heading somewhere deeply wrong, that message landed differently than it might sound. Why were these young elites attracted by a boasting swindler's imaginative lies? The answer is not so easy. This is the question that has occupied cult researchers, psychiatrists, and social psychologists since 1995. And the answers, when you look at them carefully, are both more specific and more universally applicable than most people want to acknowledge. I want to give you a documented framework for understanding exactly how this happened, because the mechanism that turned Japan's brightest young scientists into nerve gas manufacturers is the same mechanism, operating at different levels of intensity in every authoritarian group that has ever successfully recruited intelligent people. Let's start with who Asahara was, because before we can understand his followers, we need to understand him. Researchers studying cult leaders across multiple peer-reviewed studies have identified a consistent cluster of psychological traits, and Asahara demonstrated all of them. 1. Charisma, specifically interpersonal intelligence. The cult leader has a certain degree of interpersonal intelligence which pulls people into his orbit. While he is not able to reflect on his own psychological state, he understands the state of his victims, listens to them, and uses it to control them, says Dr. Alexandra Stein, who specializes in the social psychology of ideological extremism. Asahara was, by all accounts of people who met him in the early years, extraordinarily perceptive. He seemed to know what you needed before you said it. He listened with the focused attention of someone who found you genuinely fascinating. And this is not warmth. It is a form of predatory attunement, the ability to read vulnerability and reflect back exactly what it needs to hear. 2. Narcissistic grandiosity with a coherent mythology. Many cult leaders exhibit narcissistic traits, such as an inflated sense of self-importance, a strong need for admiration, and a lack of empathy for others. These traits can enable cult leaders to exploit their followers for personal gain and rationalize their actions as necessary for the greater good. Asahara didn't just claim to be enlightened. He claimed to be the specific person history had been waiting for, the one who could lead humanity through the coming apocalypse. This grandiosity, delivered with complete conviction, paradoxically increased his credibility with certain followers. Someone who believed that tentatively would be unpersuasive, and Asahara believed it, or performed belief, absolutely. 3. Authoritarian hierarchy combined with intellectual flattery. Under Asahara, the followers were classed into 7 ranks of enlightenment. All owed complete allegiance to him, but crucially, the hierarchy rewarded intellectual achievement. Scientists and doctors were given ministries. They were told their knowledge was spiritually significant, and they were made to feel that their intelligence, which had gotten them into universities but not given them meaning, was finally being used for something that mattered at a cosmic level. This is the specific mechanism for recruiting educated people. You don't tell them to stop thinking. You tell them that their thinking has led them to the most important truth available. You give them a leadership role. You make them feel chosen. 4. Apocalyptic urgency. Every high control group that has successfully recruited large numbers of intelligent people has used some version of this. The world is ending, and your decision right now, today, not tomorrow, determines whether you survive. Urgency collapses the time available for critical reflection. It makes the cost of hesitation feel existential, and for people who were already convinced that something was deeply wrong with the world they'd been shaped to serve, the urgency felt like confirmation rather than manipulation. 5. Escalating commitment through graduated disclosure. New members of Aum Shinrikyo were not told about the nerve gas program. They were not told about the murders. They were told about yoga and meditation and enlightenment and community. The darkness was introduced gradually. Each step justified by the investment already made in the previous step, each revelation framed as a deeper truth available only to those who had proven their commitment. By the time a member understood what Aum actually was, by the time the graduate student in chemistry understood that the laboratory equipment he was helping to operate was producing sarin, he had already surrendered his outside relationships, his career, his savings, and his independent identity. The cost of leaving had been engineered to be higher than the cost of staying. 6. Pseudologia Fantastica. Pathological lying as leadership strategy. The author insisted that the leader of the Aum cult, Shoko Asahara, is a person with the psychiatric syndrome described as pseudologia fantastica, a condition characterized by habitual or compulsive lying, often with an elaborate internal logic that the person may genuinely believe. This is what made Asahara different from a simple con artist. He didn't just lie strategically. He had constructed an elaborate internal reality. Himself as Messiah, his followers as the chosen, the apocalypse as inevitable, that he had inhabited with complete conviction. That conviction was infectious and was indistinguishable from the outside from genuine spiritual authority. The group was especially interested in recruiting the disaffected among the scientific community, and these were drawn into the development of toxins and weaponry. They also appeared to have targeted specific individuals with unique skills for recruitment. The staff confirmed that they recruited from the military, the police, and certain key technological industries and faculties to further their militarization and intelligence functions. This was not accidental. Aum Shinrikyo did not accidentally acquire scientists. They recruited them deliberately, specifically, because they understood that the frustration of highly educated people whose skills had not given them meaning was a vulnerability that they could exploit. Common factors are their frustration in the scientific profession, which does not give them spiritual peace, and they ask for salvation and emancipation from worldly desires by yoga or other ascetic exercises leading to the skillful instruction of Asahara. A brilliant chemist who felt that their work was meaningless, who had spent years developing expertise that served corporate interests rather than any purpose that they could believe in, was, in Asahara's hands, someone whose skills could be redirected. Someone who could be told, your knowledge is not wasted here. Here, it serves the survival of humanity. Here, it has cosmic significance. The Ministry of Science and Technology within Aum's internal government had over 300 members, including a number of skilled scientists. They built a fully operational chemical weapons program. They synthesized sarin. They attempted to produce biological agents, including botulinum toxin and anthrax. They acquired a helicopter to spray substances over cities. These were not uneducated people following orders they didn't understand. They were people whose capacity for critical thinking had been systematically redirected by a set of psychological mechanisms that are documented, reproducible, and operating right now in movements across the world. On the morning of March 20th, 1995, Asahara ordered the Tokyo subway attack, allegedly because he had been tipped off that the police were about to raid Aum facilities and wanted to create a diversion. The attack that killed 13 people and injured thousands was not the culmination of a grand apocalyptic vision. It was, in part, a panicked, tactical decision by a man trying to avoid arrest. Asahara was arrested on May 16, 1995, found hiding in a sealed room in an Aum compound near Mount Fuji. He was convicted of murder and sentenced to death. He was executed by hanging on July 6, 2018, and along with 6 senior members. Perhaps the most compelling evidence of the strength of their recruitment efforts is that at the time of the staff visit to Japan, 5 months after the Tokyo subway attack and subsequent to the arrest of most of the Aum leadership, the Aum was still successfully recruiting new followers. 5 months after a sarin attack that killed 13 people, and still recruiting. Let that sink in for a moment. Over the last 3 episodes, we've covered 3 stories that look, on the surface, different from each other. A government program that secretly harvested the bones of infants to measure nuclear contamination, a hospital that took a black woman's cells without asking and built a multi-billion-dollar industry on them while her family struggled to afford health insurance. A religious organization that recruited the most educated young scientists in Japan and turned them into weapons manufacturers. But all of these stories have a very similar thread. They are 3 expressions of the same foundational failure, the failure of science, and of the institutions that deploy it to keep the human being at the center. I want to say something directly about the history of medicine that doesn't often get said outside of academic circles. The treatments that exist today, the drugs in your medicine cabinet, the surgical procedures your doctor recommends, the vaccines that have eradicated diseases that once killed millions, were developed on a foundation that includes an enormous amount of unconsented experimentation on human bodies. Enslaved people, prisoners, the colonized, the poor, the mentally ill, racial minorities, people who walked into hospitals seeking help and left research subjects without knowing it. This is not ancient history. The Tuskegee syphilis study, which deliberately withheld treatment from black men with syphilis, ended in 1972. Project Sunshine's bone collection ran into the 1970s, and informed consent frameworks that now govern medical research were largely built in the 1990s. Henrietta Lacks' family reached a settlement with the corporation profiting from her cells just in 2023. And then there's the question of what we're paying now. The opioid crisis, which has killed over 500,000 Americans since 1999, was fueled by pharmaceutical companies and medical institutions that presented these drugs as safe and non-addictive, based on research that was, at best, inadequate, and at worst, deliberately misleading. The long-term effects of many psychiatric medications, antipsychotics, benzodiazepines, SSRIs, are still being studied and are still not fully understood decades after they became the standard treatment. The rapid development of novel drugs and treatments in a system where pharmaceutical companies fund their own clinical trials creates structural conflicts of interest and have never been adequately resolved. I'm not telling you not to take your medication. I'm not telling you to distrust your doctor. I'm telling you that the history we've covered across these 3 episodes, Project Sunshine, Henrietta Lacks, Aum Shinrikyo, should inform how you engage with medical institutions. Not with paranoia, with informed and active participation. Ask what a drug has been studied for and for how long. Ask about the conflict of interest disclosures on the research. Ask what the alternatives are and why this one is being recommended. Understand that the history of medicine is a history of genuine miracle and genuine exploitation simultaneously, and that knowing both is what makes you a participant in your own care rather than a subject of it. Now, what could it look like instead? If these 3 episodes have been about failure, about what science produces when it operates without ethical accountability, without genuine consent, without keeping the human being at the center, I want to close with this vision. Because the version of medicine I want to imagine for you is not science fiction. It exists in fragments, in experiments, in movements that are building it right now. Imagine medicine that begins with the assumption that your knowledge of your own body is clinically relevant, that your reported experience of pain, of side effects, of treatment response is data that the system is designed to take seriously rather than dismiss. Imagine research funding that is genuinely independent of the corporation whose products are being studied, that produces results that serve patients rather than stock prices. Imagine informed consent that is actually informative, that gives you real information about what is known and unknown about a treatment, what the alternatives are, what the history of the research is, and what happens to your biological material after it leaves your body. Imagine a system in which the people whose bodies were exploited to build the foundation of modern medicine, the enslaved, the incarcerated, the poor, the women of color who were experimented on without consent across centuries, are acknowledged, named, and in some cases compensated. Imagine Henrietta Lacks' name on the first page of every paper that uses a HeLa cell line. None of this is impossible. Some of it is already happening. The bioethics field that emerged from these scandals has genuinely changed what is required of researchers. The common rule, institutional review boards, informed consent requirements. These exist because people pushed for them, because journalists wrote about abuses, because families like the Lacks family refused to be quiet. The mechanism of change is the same in medicine as it is in every institution we've covered on this show. Here's what I want you to take from this trilogy. The scientists who carried Sarin onto Tokyo subway trains were not born without conscience. They were people whose conscience had been systematically redirected by a set of documented, reproducible psychological mechanisms. They are the most extreme example of what happens when intelligent people surrender their judgment entirely to an external authority. When they decide that someone else's vision of the greater good overrides their own moral reasoning. The antidote is not cynicism. The antidote is not refusing to believe in anything larger than yourself. The antidote is keeping your own judgment active and engaged, even and especially when an institution or a leader or a community tells you that surrendering it is the highest form of devotion. Science, at its best, is the most rigorous expression of that active judgment. It demands evidence. It requires verification. It insists on the falsifiability of its own conclusions. It is, by design, a system that cannot function if a single authority's word is treated as final. When science loses that, when it becomes an instrument of an institution's agenda or a leader's vision or a government's strategic interest, it stops being science and it becomes a weapon. Project Sunshine was science as a weapon against the people it was supposed to protect. HeLa was science as extraction from a body that deserved to be a partner. Aum Shinrikyo was science as a weapon aimed at a subway station by people who had been told they were saving the world. In each case, the failure was the same. Someone decided the mission was more important than the person. Don't let anyone tell you about your own life. Don't let any institution, any leader, any movement convince you that what you know about your own experience is less valid than what they know about the greater good. Your body is yours. Your mind is yours. Your judgment is yours. Keep them. Next week on The Periphery, he called it a self-improvement program. Women paid thousands of dollars to join. Then they were branded with his initials. Keith Raniere built one of the most sophisticated psychological control operations in modern history and recruited actresses, heiresses, and executives to run it for him. Next week, NXIVM. This has been the conclusion of a 3-part series. If you haven't listened to episode 5 and 6, Project Sunshine and the story of Henrietta Lacks, I'd encourage you to go back and listen from the beginning. The 3 episodes are designed to be heard together, and the full weight of what we've been building lands harder when you've been with us for it all. The sources for everything in this episode are in the description below, including the peer-reviewed psychiatric literature on Asahara's psychology, the congressional investigation records, and Robert J. Lifton's essential work on thought reform, which underpins so much of the framework we've built across this show. Subscribe to The Periphery on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts, and leave me a comment with this. Which of the 6 qualities of cult leaders that we've covered today have you seen operating in the world around you?